Robbie Astrop. I'm with ABM Industries. I'll talk a little bit about that company, but what I wanted to do here was kind of frame the conversation for the panel and touch on the various considerations when we think about different ownership models. And the way I'll preface all of this is that there is no one model today that's been decided on the industry. Every jurisdiction, state, locality, there are different models being deployed right now, depending on a variety of factors, from the technology to the stakeholder to the use case. And from my observation, there's a lot of new suppliers coming into the market, new models being created, and the industry is going through a try it out phase right now, where we're kind of doing this in the American way, which is kind of there's incentives put in place, the market structures in place, and the commercial entities are competing to try to figure out the best path forward to support the market. And we're seeing a lot of issues pop up and new creative ways of putting these pieces of equipment in the ground. So before I get into that, I will touch on why I'm here, who ABM is. ABM Industries was actually founded in 1904 by a guy with a mop and a bucket. Started out as a very small company and grew to over 130,000 employees today. Main focus is on electrical and facilities maintenance. And their position in the EV space is in turnkey construction, engineering, design, and deployment of various technologies. We've brought to market over 35 technologies from a hardware software perspective, and have installed more than 20,000 stations nationwide. A lot of those installs were within our dealership network, but we also have a focus on aviation, fleet, C&I, and education. ABM is the third largest parking space operator in the United States and one of the largest shuttle operators. And one of the projects that we're deploying right now is with the LAX airport in California. We're deploying 1,200 stations at that airport to help the airport monetize those spaces. And it really leverages all of our capability. And so what I wanted to touch on was a little bit around the various use cases that EV charging can be framed as and applied to, the stakeholders involved, and then technical considerations when we think about ownership models, who's best to operate, who's best to maintain, who's best to deploy. And I'll just kind of define some of these terms here to set up the conversation and tee up Graham and Peter and Jim and their discussion. So on the application side, we have, I started to create a noodle soup of lines about how all this is interconnected, and it just became incredibly complicated and didn't convey the message. So I just wanted to define some terms, talk about various applications that we've seen in the field, and then frame the conversation. So when we talk about depot charging, that's really a focus on fleets, whereby we're all looking at this through a utility lens. Those are often behind the gate, high power charging for larger vehicles. Typically, utilities don't have access to this, but they want to understand the load, want to be cognizant of the fact that a large industrial customer is electrifying its fleet because it has implications for the circuits in that area. On-the-go charging is probably the most common and what we see in utility-owned models, because of utilities being well suited to deploy things in the public sphere with the right-of-way and assets available to service those applications. But that's the primary stakeholder in an on-the-go charging application would be the driver pulling up on the go to charge their vehicle and keep going down the road. Workplace charging is another popular application, and both workplace and multifamily, typically the owner-operator of those applications is looking at it from an amenity perspective. So to attract employees, to keep tenants, that sort of thing. And then, of course, residential, which is a primary driver. As Oscar had mentioned, 85% of charging will take place at folks' homes. Now, all of these different applications have implications for the utility. I think it was mentioned before, this electrification space is analogous to air conditioning back in the 60s when that proliferated the grid and saw a drastic increase in demand and loads coming onto the electrical grid. Is what we're seeing now. And then from a stakeholder perspective, utilities, drivers, fleets, governments, commercial entities, and then the manufacturers all have different motivations for different use cases and what they would like to see happen. But it all actually affects the utility in one way or another as the provider of power. Drivers, if you haven't observed it yet, just a point of note, are incredibly vocal about their EV charging stations and their vehicles. They're a very passionate group. And so one of the things I've observed, at least in the utility own and operate, is that brand on there, they're going to start calling the utility. If you choose to put your co-op logo, they're going to call the co-op, and they don't care what part of the co-op they're calling, right? I mean, they're not calling the EV department because there is none. So there's early stages in this, when utilities entered own operate, they kind of assigned it to a guy, and he's the EV guy, but he's also got all his other responsibilities. And then he's saying, we got a station down, I need to dispatch. I guess I'm gonna send a lineman out there, but that guy's got a cutout blown, and what's his priority, right? So the way these groups have been established now, a lot of especially in the IOU space, they're setting up dedicated groups to eMobility to manage these assets in the field. Governments and even commercial have different motivations. State governments will have aggressive goals for sustainability and decarbonization. I know specifically the state of Virginia is trying to 100% decarbonize by 2050. And then the government directive and how that is achieved is open to interpretation and would involve multiple stakeholders and technologies and use cases. But, one example of the nuance to this is the government could say, we're going to buy all electric vehicles by 2030. And then you get into, the usable life of an ICE vehicle. Do I just sell off usable vehicles that have another 5 years on them? EVs may not be available in certain asset classes. The range may not be there for the utility of that vehicle. And so a lot of these stakeholders have their own motivations for encouraging proliferation of EV. And all this ties in from a use case, a stakeholder perspective, to the technology that's deployed on the station. Because there's a lot of, I forget who mentioned it, I think it was Peter. There's a lot of new technologies coming into this market, a lot of PowerPoints out there showing how great all this stuff works. But when it gets down to the actual execution of the application, these technical use cases, the utilities typically want to be involved, but may not be motivated to do so. For instance, for integrating solar and battery storage into a large DCFC installation, if the utility is not owning that, that is actually not benefiting the load, but then you have to service it when those DER assets aren't actually active. So to touch on the different models before I pass the mic here, utility own operate as one. There's also OEM own operate, where a supplier will actually deploy stations and operate them to drive revenue themselves. Then there's the real estate owner and the commercial owner. So the difference between those two is that what I learned pretty quickly in this business is that the landowner and the occupant of that building could be two different entities with diverging interests. And so how do you motivate those competing interests to put stations out to the benefit of the tenants? And then, of course, residential. People are buying these things, put them in their home. And I just put a note on here, too, that the rebate and incentive design can drive a lot of the ownership model that's going to actually come to fruition in a certain geography. And this is being driven by the state, the federal government, as well as utility commissions. And then a newer model that a lot of larger entities are looking at is charging as a service. which essentially amortizes the cost of the infrastructure over 10 or 15 years. So you have a monthly payment instead of a large capital outlay at the beginning of the project. So, you. Who's last?